Guildford Games is a grassroots community initiative from a team of people actively involved in the Guildford Games industry, and last week was their annual Guildford Games Festival, the biggest one yet, across 2 sites, showcasing developers and supporting businesses from the area that they like to call the Hollywood of games. So I went along and took the opportunity to speak to some of the people in the queue, waiting for the doors to open, less red carpet and more red noses from the cold February morning. So welcome to this very first Q&A episode of the Crunch Button with questions live from Guildford Games Festival 2025. Welcome back to the Crunch Button. This is a Q&A episode, the first. I hope to do lots of these. It's going to have a slightly different tone and tempo to the introduction episodes that you might have already seen. My name's Nathan Baisley. I've been a senior producer and a game director in the video game industry for 17 years. And in this series, we pull back the digital curtain. We talk about how games are made in professional development studios. So last week I went to the Guildford Games Festival. Now Guildford has been a hub for game development for probably 40 years. Going back to Bullfrog probably is the start of it, and those seminal titles like Populous, Syndicate, Theme Park. Peter Molyneux was one of the 2 founders. He was at the Guildford Games Festival doing a talk. Now the story that I heard was that every time a game finished, some of the developers splintered off and started a new studio, and so that is the start of the proliferation of game developers in the area. Now Bullfrog got sold to Electronic Arts, so EA comes into the area at some point. Peter goes on to found Lionhead, where we get Black and White and the Fable games, and then that gets sold to Microsoft, again bringing in another big company. So over the years, more and more developers start. People looking to start new studios are attracted to the area because the resources are here and the developers are here. And then over time, it's built up to a very significant hub of game developers. So I went along to the festival. It's definitely the biggest one so far. It's the first one, I believe, across 2 sites. So at the adjacent hotel, there was a developer summit for professionals, and then the G Live, which is the main event, is open to the public. It tends to attract a lot of students and gamers who are interested in playing some historical games, some of the new games that are coming out, meeting some of the game developers. And so I went to the queue, and a lot of people standing in the cold, waiting for the doors to open. And I thought I'd take the opportunity to ask a few people if they had any questions and kick off our kind of Q&A episodes with some of the people waiting to go into Guildford Games. So without further ado, let's listen to our first question. So does anyone have a question that they'd like to ask a game developer?
How would you come up with the idea generation when it comes to games?
So brilliantly, the very first question I got was actually the subject of the first episode that we put together. So that felt like a lovely bit of serendipity. So if you haven't already seen episode 1 from the intros series, then please go back. We spend 12 minutes or so talking about where the ideas come from. But let's tackle this question, see if we can, take a slightly different perspective on it. There's a few things, first of all, to say as a point of clarification. There's a difference between the opportunity and the idea. And then when we're talking about the ideas, there's a difference between, where did you get the idea to make a racer, like, the genre, what have you, versus an apocalyptic racer, like this style, where you have to do whatever. Like probably the thing that we will think about as the game. And then there's another layer underneath, which is and then all the details that add up to that. Where do those ideas come from? Talking about the opportunity first. So a publisher or the money people will tend to create the opportunity space. They'll tend to say, we've got some budget for this, we're going after this audience, or there's this new peripheral that we've got some money to support, or we want to be first with the next generation of titles, so we've got some budget to make something for PlayStation 6 or whatever it happens to be. And so you tend to start with that opportunity space and then come up with ideas within it in order to take the opportunity. Now, you're probably most interested in that middle bit when it comes to the ideas. Like if somebody comes up with the idea of an apocalyptic racer, which is all about style points or, I don't know, earning rations or surviving in post-apocalypse, where does that come from? There's a lot of brainstorming. There tends to be more than one person, firstly, and those ideas are coming from all over the place, from movies that people have seen, from music that they've listened to, from other games they've played, from theatre, from a story that they read, all sorts of places. What's much more pertinent is how those ideas get filtered and selected and tested. They generally get tested against the opportunity. So if you have the idea of an apocalyptic racer, what can we make that? Is that within our skill set as a development team? What audience is it for? How are they currently served? What are the competitor products like? Are we going into a market that's kind of saturated, or is there actually an opportunity there? So that testing of the idea is much more important to the idea itself. And then once you've got the start of it, once you think, there is an opportunity to make an apocalyptic racer that's about earning rations, then as the team gets bigger and bigger, so more and more people are contributing to that central idea. And a lot of the things that as gamers we see and like in the game come from that next level down.
Anyone else got any questions? You've got one, I can tell.
I'm thinking of, what do you do if your target audience for a game is like, for example, the younger audience, but then you end up making a game that like older audience or teenagers or adults like more?
I absolutely love this question, because you obviously understand that the audience is at the heart of what it is that we're making. So let's think about this. In my experience, it's actually quite rare to release a game, to get all those years through development, to release a game, and then to find out that the audience appeal is slightly different to what you expect. I'm sure it has happened. It's much more common to discover that as you're going through. So what tends to happen is that you begin your project thinking this is who this is for. We've identified the audience, hopefully you've done that, and you've identified therefore the size of the opportunity, and you've identified all the competitor products and all the things associated with the people that you're aiming for. And then as you go through, you have these points of check-in with the audience, whether it's user testing or maybe a bit of focus testing or whatever it happens to be, going out and doing a show, demoing, whatever. You get these points where people see the game through development and their feedback is received by all stakeholders. So what is much more common is that your design is being checked by the people you're aiming for, and the feedback they're giving you is being addressed. So by the time you get to release, it is much more applicable to them than it might have been if you hadn't spoken to them all the way through development. Another thing to say is that probably most games still, you get to the end, maybe you do a patch or two, but then you abandon it and then move on to the next thing. That, I think, is still the most typical experience. And so when you get to the end, if it does happen to have found a different audience, well, there's no one there to hear that feedback. Perhaps that becomes more relevant if for some reason you decide to do a sequel. So what we're left with then are the games where you release it and then you have an intention to support it with DLC or patches or whatever for a period of time. And then the question almost doesn't really matter, because you are listening to feedback and you're looking at telemetry, which is data that you get back from the game itself, and you're making choices about changes and additions based upon that. So whatever audience it's found, even if it's the audience you originally intended, you are responding to their feedback. And I suppose over time that game is being shaped even better for the people who enjoy playing it. One other thing to say, and I've had this experience twice, it's quite common in game development for the developers to want to make the game for themselves, or they want to make it for the sort of 20 to 35 kind of younger, most dedicated crowd. And I have had it on a couple of occasions where the very nature of the game we're making obviously skews young, or sometimes I'm sure the opposite, skews much older, or skews more casual, we used to say. And so that can be a point of change in development, because there is a tendency, which is wrong, for people to kind of make games for themselves.
Ready to go?
How did you alter your skills for the industry?
Before I joined the game industry, I had 10 years as a project manager with a little bit of product management thrown in the manufacturing industry. And so I had a little team, and we would look at the entire product range of the company we worked for. And every year we would introduce, between 1 and 5 brand new products from scratch. And then a whole load, dozens of small product innovations and product changes. The system that we used, or the process that we used to manage those projects, is what's known as waterfall. That's a very dependency-driven project management technique. Think about building a house. You have to build the foundations before you can build the walls. You have to build the walls before you can plaster the walls, before you can lay the floors. You have to lay the floors before you can lay the carpet. So if you position all of those tasks on a diagram, and we call it a Gantt chart, it looks like a waterfall, because you have one that then leads to the next, that leads to the next, that leads to the next. In that waterfall process, you begin with a spec, you do the work, and then you validate. These are all generalisms, of course, but that's broadly how that works. When you're making a video game, it should be a more iterative process, because actually you're trying to find the fun. And it's not the case that you can just specify the game, leave a development team to make it, and then come back, and if they've done all the tasks, it's going to be fun. It just doesn't work like that. So instead of using waterfall, we use something called agile. And within agile, there's a couple of techniques. One is called Scrum, one's called Kanban. Scrum has this concept of sprints, and the idea with a sprint is that instead of doing this spec and then validate from waterfall once across the whole project, you do that every 2 weeks. So every 2 weeks you begin by specifying the work, doing the work, and then validating it. And by inserting a very high frequency review process, in theory, you increase the quality, you are more adapted to change, and so on. So for me, that was the big thing that I needed to brush up on in terms of skills. Having said that, Agile is rooted in something called Lean. Lean was something that we did in manufacturing. Lean is about looking for waste in the process. Waste is anything the customer isn't paying for. And then there's a series of processes and tools which are designed to reduce, if not eliminate, waste. And amongst them are some things called Kanban. And then we now do Kanban as part of Agile in video games. Kaizen, which means continuous improvement. Well, that's the whole ethos behind Agile. So there were a lot of parallels, but that was probably the biggest thing. In terms of soft skills, actually it was much easier to work in games than in manufacturing, simply because the vast majority of developers want to make games. They love what they do, and they want to make high quality games. So as a producer or a project manager, the difference between walking up to a game developer and saying, "Can you do this?" versus in the manufacturing industry was the difference between someone said, "Yes, how can I help?" and somebody who needed to be negotiated into doing what was necessary.
Question, you got one?
No, I can't think of
Any questions? Yeah, great.
What's the best way to start in game making or game design?
And one related one.
Do you have any questions?
How to stick with it when getting into the industry is difficult at the beginning.
Okay, so I asked some of my younger colleagues to help with this question, because personally I'm many years since I joined the industry, and I thought that I'd ask somebody who joined some people who joined more recently than that. And so the advice, I'm sure that you've heard it before, are things like take part in game jams, make sure that you learn things like Unreal so you know the tools that the industry are using, follow the news, make prototypes, create a website, take advantage of opportunities like Guildford Games where we met. And so you're introducing yourselves to developers, form connections, be flexible, be prepared to move if you can, relocate and go where the work is. So fairly obvious things that you're probably already doing. I'm going to add a few things myself. From the design point of view, I would encourage you to be a critic, always, and to think way outside of video games when you're thinking about design. For example, if I go into a car park, my senses are attuned to the layout, the signage. If I use one of the old machines that you put money into, like how is it laid out, what options are being given to me, you can apply that critical eye to everything. You can be watching a movie and thinking, why is that character saying that? Why is the camera positioned here? Why is the music doing that at this point? Why is the color palette changed? If you train yourself, or just always be like alert to design everywhere, and don't assume that everything is good design either. Literally be a critic. Those skills are super useful when it comes to actually designing video games as well. Now, another central thing about design, in my opinion, is the audience and who is it for. When you play video games, or when you make video games, and you are a fan of video games, you can be slightly blinded by your own interests and likes, biases, and you may well, if you work in the game industry, be making a game for somebody not like you. And so having that kind of sense trained elsewhere, where you think about who is this product for, why has it been built like that, how is it serving their needs, what alternatives did that person have, that will make you a better game designer. And then on the subject of like how do you maintain enthusiasm and so on, let's be really honest. Right now the industry is in a very difficult position, and it's not just people who are struggling to join the industry, but there are thousands of people who've been in the industry for years who have been losing their jobs. So look, things will probably become a little bit more stable in a year or 2 years time. And we all need an income. So don't be afraid if you're struggling to get into the industry that this is your only opportunity. If you need an income and you need to take other work and then you apply again in a few years, particularly if you take on a sort of discipline adjacent role, by which I mean if you're a programmer and you go and work for a bank for a little bit, lovely, lots of extra money there. Or if you're a designer and you can get some app work or something that is kind of adjacent, or a producer like I was, being a project manager elsewhere, particularly if it's in software, anything you can get close to the industry and then demonstrate, you know, in a couple of years when hopefully things are more stable, then that should help. And then also use your evenings if you're that way inclined to make prototypes and do game jams. That can't hurt. So if you really want to get in and you can't, don't give up. Yeah, but be aware that right now is very challenging time for all of us. Right, we've got one more question.
Do you have any questions? No? Anyone?
What's your favourite idea for a game that you want to make?
There are two ideas that come to mind. Over the years, obviously, I've been involved in lots and lots of concept development and proposed lots of ideas. There are two things that I've always been very excited about, so I might as well just share those. So one is a sort of Animal Crossing style game where you've got that kind of community of characters and you've got those variables of who happens to live in your village and what objects you have, and you can build whatever. You have the town hall, don't you? But you can build other things. So I like that idea of like the variability in a town and the characters that you could have. But I like the idea of then using that to drive narrative, almost in a kind of soap opera style way. So I came up with lots of ideas around that theme, and I was particularly drawn to a kind of, well, how would you describe it? Like a slight horror kind of tone to it, or bizarre, maybe weird, maybe kind of Tales of the Unexpected, maybe that kind of vibe, as a wrapper around a kind of Animal Crossing style game. Now that was before Cult of the Lamb, and Cult of the Lamb isn't quite what I had in mind, but it is definitely encroaching in the similar space. So that's one. And then the other idea that I like and I'd like to make one day is more of a story-driven game about a kind of old rock star who has had fame and then lost it, and then is kind of trying to reconnect and rebuild bridges that he burned. I think it's a theme that's quite appealing, and I think that it gives a lot of potential gameplay and, you know, a nice arc, whether it's like getting the band back together or you know, fixing things or helping the next generation of talent through. So yeah, so those two ideas are probably my favourite things that I've thought up in the past that I'd like to build one day. Well, that was lots of fun. Thank you so much to everybody who contributed questions, and to anybody who's joined the channel since we met at Guildford Games. Thank you for joining me. Please comment with any more questions you've got, either on this video or in future videos, and we'll answer them in another Q&A episode to come. The next episode will be another one of the intros, so keep an eye open for that. That's it then. Thank you very much. See you again.